Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Matthew McManus. He is a lecturer in the Department of Political Science at the University of Michigan. He is the author of several books, and today we're talking about his latest one, The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism. So, Dr. McManus, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. Always happy to hear that some people in Portugal are interested in what I'm doing.
Yeah, sure. So let's start perhaps with some definitions here before we get into liberal socialism itself. Of course, I think this is a combination of liberalism and socialism. So, first of all, tell us what is liberalism, what is socialism, or perhaps about some of the main tenets that come from each of them that then come together in liberal socialism, and then we can talk a little bit more about liberal socialism itself.
Absolutely. So these are actually quite difficult questions, in no small part because when we're talking about doctrines like liberalism or socialism, they've been around for hundreds of years. Many different people have espoused them. Major philosophers from very different traditions have aligned with them or criticized them. So I tend to agree with Dr. Alan Ryan that it makes more sense to talk about liberalisms, plural, and socialisms, plural, than a kind of single unitary doctrine. That means pretty much the same thing everywhere, regardless of circumstance, regardless of ideological development. So just very briefly, I argue that at the core of liberalism, its moral core, is a commitment to two, perhaps three principles. The first principle is a commitment to the moral equality of all human beings. What this just means is that it's as important that your life goes well as that my life goes well, as that some other person in Uganda's life goes well, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this doesn't mean that liberals, by and large, have been committed to social equality for all individuals, or even economic equality for all individuals. But it does mean that you're supposed to be granted things like formal legal equality, equality of rights. If you're a utilitarian, your needs are considered equally in kind of a hedonic or aggregative calculus, that kind of thing. The second principle that I argue liberals are committed to is this idea of liberty for all. And that flows to a certain extent from this commitment to the moral equality of all individuals. Because if you acknowledge that people are moral equals, entitled to certain kinds of basic rights or certain basic considerations, then there's something that liberals find worrisome about this idea that I'm in a position to tell you how to run your life because I possess superior intellect or superior virtue, or I'm higher up some kind of social totem pole. I'm an aristocrat or a priest or whoever it happens to be. And so from this commitment to moral equality flows this commitment to certain kinds of basic liberties, right? Freedom of expression, freedom of speech, toleration for religious views, et cetera, et cetera. And then last but not least, I point out that many liberals, particularly in continental European traditions, are also committed to the principle of fraternity or solidarity. This, of course, is the third in the trinity of French revolutionary principles, right? Liberté, égalité, solidarité, or fraternité. Now, many Anglo-liberals would be wary of expressing a commitment to fraternity or solidarity precisely because they are wary of species of French liberalism. But there's no doubt that in a continental European context, this idea of showing solidarity with one's fellow citizens and emphasizing Republican forms of participation in community has been essential to many streams of liberal thought.
Mm-hmm. And so that's about, yeah, I think you talked mostly about liberalism. What about socialism? I mean, what aspects of socialism then come together with liberalism in liberal socialism?
Absolutely. Well, the classic definition of socialism is social ownership of the means of production, or even democratic ownership of the means of production. And again, I'd like to iterate that this has been understood in vastly different ways by different socialist traditions. Obviously, you have authoritarian forms of socialism or statist forms of socialism, like what you saw in the Soviet Union, for example, where this has been understood as state management of the means of production, really party management of the means of production in many circumstances, right? But it's also been understood in much more individualistic ways by liberal socialists like John Stuart Mill, where Mill understood this as essentially a commitment to worker-owned firms. So rather than having capitalists run major economic firms, the workers would run them themselves, and then the state would play an ameliorative role by offering redistribution to the poor. Sorry, my cat is very enthusiastically playing with a ball around here. I also point out that almost all socialists are committed to, at least in principle, the same kind of moral ideals as many liberals. If you were to ask socialists, are you committed to this idea of liberty for all, equality for all, and certainly solidarity or fraternity for all, they would, of course, say yes. But all socialists would point out that it would be impossible to actually achieve those ideals without actually committing oneself to social ownership or democratic ownership of the means of production, precisely because one cannot be truly free, and one certainly cannot be equal in an economic context where various forms of domination are given such wide berth.
So, and then liberal socialism. What are the core tenets of liberal socialism, and how do liberalism and socialism come together here?
Absolutely. So, in my book and in other writings that people can check out if they're interested, I say that there are three core principles that define liberal socialism. So, just to kind of provide a little bit of description by contrast, I say that liberal socialism is one species of liberalism and indeed one species of socialism. It is committed to these basic principles, but by no means would all liberals or socialists also be committed to these principles. And we can get into some of these contrasts later on if you wish. But the first principle I argue all liberal socialists are committed to is a commitment to normative individualism and methodological collectivism. Now, those are pretty technical terms, but by methodological collectivism, what I just mean is that liberal socialists view human beings the same way that Aristotle would understand human beings, or Mill would understand human beings, or for that matter, Marx would understand human beings, that we're fundamentally social animals, and that we can only realize our full human potentials in a social setting. Now, this can seem like a rather abstract point, but I actually think it's extremely concrete, right? So oftentimes I'll talk to my students and I'll ask them, have you had a happy moment in your life, like a genuinely happy moment? Most of them will say yes. A few of them say no, and that always worries me. But then I'll ask them as a follow-up, were you by yourself when you enjoyed this happy moment? And invariably, they'll always say, no, of course not, right? I was with my friends, I was with my family, my boyfriend, my girlfriend, even my husband, for some of the older students. And I point out, well, this is a nice demonstration of what Aristotle, Hegel, Marx, Mill we're about, right? That it's only in social conditions with other people that we can realize our full human potentials. If you are left alone on an island like Robinson Crusoe with all the resources in the world, but no one to interact with and no one to realize your capacities with, people would be very, very unhappy very quickly. Think about like Will Smith in the I Am Legend movie, right? So that's the methodological collectivism bit. The normative individualism bit is I point out that all liberal socialists are committed to the idea that it is the development of the individual's human capacities that is of moral importance for people who are committed to this doctrine. Not, for instance, the flourishing of some reified abstraction like the nation or civilization or people or the Volk, for example. Now, this might seem self-evident to some people who are committed to certain forms of normative individualism, but is of course by no means self-evident to those who take a more Volkish approach to morality. I think it's appropriate for the individual to occasionally be sacrificed for the good of the greater community. Liberal socialists would have no truck with that. And contemporaneously, some liberal socialists or people who are aligned with left egalitarianism at the least would say that we also have to take into account future generations. So that's an interesting philosophical question. We don't need to get into it right now. But the argument would be that future individuals that are almost certainly going to come to be, they are entitled to certain kinds of weightings and philosophic calculuses that we might make. So that's the first principle of liberal socialism that I say everyone is committed to, and probably the most important one. The second principle of liberal socialism that I think everyone is committed to is to what I call a developmental rather than an acquisitive ethic. Now, again, these are technical terms, but I'll start off by talking about the acquisitive ethic, because I think that the contrast with the developmental ethic becomes more clear that way. So an acquisitive ethic is a term that is drawn from C.B. Macpherson, the great Canadian political theorist, in his book, The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism. And in this book, Macpherson is very critical of proto-liberal thinkers like Locke or Hobbes, arguing that they had this very atomistic understanding of human beings as more or less purely self-interested, highly competitive, and they defined life more or less in terms of the pursuit of desire after desire, right? The acquisition of goods to gratify our hedonic urges. And, the understanding of human beings that emerges from this is the richer that I am and the more stuff that I have and the more I'm able to outcompete other people to get all those riches and all that stuff, the better off I'm doing. And McPherson was very critical of this for the same reason, say, Aristotle would be very critical of it. And this is what leads me to the developmental ethic, where I say we should commit ourselves not to this idea that human beings are made happy by acquiring a lot of stuff. Instead, we should realize that most human beings are much happier when their fundamental human faculties or their fundamental human capacities are developed in certain kinds of refined ways. And this is a point that Mill especially made very emphatically, inspired by the German philosopher Humboldt, right? Where Mill said, most people get a lot more satisfaction out of starting off as a father and becoming a good father and a better father over time, right? Developing those capacities, or wanting to write a book, maybe failing a couple of times. Anybody who's a writer will know, that's kind of part of the process, and then getting better and better over time as they start to develop those faculties. Or, think about a musician, right? Nobody is especially good at the violin when they first pick it up. I know my sister plays the violin and she really struggled with it at the beginning, but you take lessons, you practice, you put in the time, and eventually you get better at doing that. So liberal socialists are committed to the idea that it's this developmental ethic that we should be fostering instead of the acquisitive ethic, because it's the development of human capacities in harmonious social settings that make people happy, rather than, again, just acquiring a lot of stuff to gratify our human urges. It's not that that is completely unimportant. Obviously, we need food, shelter, cars now, especially in order to fulfill our basic functions, but it's not the be all and end all in life. And then the very last principle of liberal socialism, and then I promise I'll stop, is its commitment to the realization of economic democracy in a liberal democratic political context that includes respect for the basic liberal rights, of course, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, but does not put the same kind of maximal weight on the importance of private property that classical liberals, for instance, would think is absolutely sacrosanct. So, for instance, all liberal socialists would say one is not entitled to private ownership of the means of production, particularly where private ownership of the means of production in the hands of capital will lead to the emergence of new forms of domination. In fact, liberal socialists insist that we need to extend liberal principles of democracy, non-domination, and basic rights into the economy, precisely to protect workers against the potential forms of domination that can emerge in private government, as Elizabeth Anderson would put it. So those are the three core principles of liberal socialism as I understand them. All liberal socialist thinkers that I talk about in my book understand these in slightly various ways, and some of them put more emphasis on the one rather than the other. And we can get into that a little bit if you'd like. But I think that that's the normative core of the doctrine.
And how do people tend to react to a term such as liberal socialism, particularly the liberals and the socialists, when they see this term and they feel like they're lumped together into one single theory, one single ideology, let's say? Are there aspects that particularly that people think that from liberalism and socialism would contradict each other, and they see perhaps problems with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for a certain generation of figures that are weaned on what Samuel Moyn calls Cold War liberalism, they see liberal socialism as just an oxymoronic idea, right? Because they usually will make claims like, well, liberalism is committed to individualism, whereas socialism is committed to collectivism, or liberalism is committed to individual rights and democracy, whereas socialism is inherently statist and authoritarian, right? Now, I want to be clear. There are without a doubt authoritarian forms of socialism that have had no respect for rights. And anyone with even an inkling of sympathy for the liberal tradition would want to be very, very critical of that and reject it emphatically. But I point out that this understanding is very historically inaccurate, right? And it's frankly quite contemporary, right? It's just the product of the kind of Cold War environment where these simplistic bifurcations were ideologically important for a lot of people to try to make sense of why it is that many liberal states were rivalrous with communist states. But more sophisticated understandings of the liberal tradition in particular, certainly those that are coming out recently, have pointed out that through the 19th century up until the early 20th century, liberals like John Stuart Mill, or for that matter, John Maynard Keynes, John Dewey, were very happy to learn from socialists, to even identify as socialist in many circumstances, and to draw an elective affinity or symmetry between the egalitarian, liberatory, and humanist goals of liberalism and the egalitarian, humanist, and liberatory goals of liberalism, since both are Enlightenment doctrines, arguably even mature Enlightenment doctrines. So part and parcel of my project is one of historical clarification, where I try to indicate that this bifurcation between liberalism and socialism that became quite common in the mid to late 20th century is a historical abnormality that underplays the long dialogue that has existed between the two traditions. And part of what I'm hoping to do is, of course, restart that dialogue, since I think it was fruitful and productive, even if, of course, it could be acrimonious at different points.
So let's talk a little bit about the historical background of liberal socialism here. So how far back do you think we would need to go to understand the origins of liberal socialism?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I want to make clear my own limitations, right? So my work is, as the title would suggest, a work of political theory. So I mainly trace the origins of liberal socialism in thought by looking at important political theorists and political thinkers who systematize insights about the relationship between liberalism and socialism, or offer schemas of liberal socialism in a fairly refined way, right? Someone who approaches the liberal or socialist traditions from a different standpoint, like say Edmund Fawcett, might take a kind of different tack. But in my case, I start the story that I'm telling with Thomas Paine and Mary Wollstonecraft, two liberal thinkers or proto-liberal thinkers, depending on who you talk to, that have been wildly influential. For those who don't know, I'll start by talking about Thomas Paine, and then I'll move on to Wollstonecraft. Thomas Paine was an enormously important revolutionary thinker in the late 18th century. Many people see him as the chief ideologue, actually, of not one but two revolutions, the American Revolution and the French Revolution. So in the case of the American Revolution, his most famous contribution is a pamphlet called Common Sense. Common Sense in the American tradition is one of the great works of political literature. It is widely read to the troops fighting in the revolutionary armies, because it just offered a scathing indictment of the British aristocracy, pointing out that it was a ridiculous idea and making a case for a republican system of government that's respectful of the rights of man. So seen from this standpoint, if you just look at Common Sense, Paine looks an awful lot like kind of an American liberal, right? Very committed to individual rights, limited government, Republican forms of participation, that kind of thing. But as I point out in the book, his opinion starts to shift in a more egalitarian direction by the time of the second half of an important book he writes called The Rights of Man, and in pamphlets like Agrarian Justice. And a lot of this was inspired by the second revolution Paine was part of, the French Revolution. So in the first parts of The Rights of Man, Paine offers just a scathing indictment of the conservative Edmund Burke, who wrote an important book criticizing the French Revolution called Reflections on the Revolution in France, which people should also read if they get a chance. But in the second half of The Rights of Man, Paine makes some very interesting arguments about private property, where he starts to suggest that private property is not a natural institution, the way that, say, Locke and subliberals thought it was. It's very much a social institution. It came about as a kind of artificial social project where people who have a lot of property, in effect, dispossessed those who did not have a lot of property. Now, Paine argues it's not necessarily the worst thing in the world for people to have private property, because he thinks that that is vital to incentivize things like cultivation. But he says, look, if you possess an enormous amount of private property and you have dispossessed people de facto by owning it, then you owe society, and especially the poor, a debt for the possession of that private property. And this becomes even more vehement in Agrarian Justice, where he says there's this enormous amount of reverence that is paid to private property that borders on a fetish or even a kind of mystical ideology. And he says that as the world becomes more mature, we're going to start to see this fetish become considerably depleted in terms of its ideological power. So from these kinds of extrapolations, Paine goes on to argue for essentially a welfare state, one of the first people to kind of offer systematic arguments to that effect. So just to kind of very briefly summarize what Paine argues, he claims that people should get a universal pension after the age of 50 that should become more generous when they hit the age of 65. He thinks that all education should be free for anybody who is capable. He argues for guaranteed employment, and not just guaranteed employment, but quality employment for anybody who wants it, particularly in major urban cities. He also argues that women should receive a stipend after giving birth, both for their troubles and also to kind of help give themselves and their children a head start in life. And then he also argues that at the upon reaching the age of maturity, all people should receive what amounts to a universal inheritance, right? Quite generous for the time, again, to kind of get them started off in life in the era of their maturity. So there are other kind of things that he proposes also about meals and so on, but we don't need to get into that. But all this flows from this commitment Paine has that property is an artificial social institution, not a natural institution. It might have certain uses, but clearly he thinks an excess amount of reverence to private property ceases to be useful when it allows mass concentrations of wealth, when that wealth could be better used to ameliorate the condition of the poor, and indeed even ameliorate the condition of the working classes. So let's move on to Mary Wollstonecraft. So in Wollstonecraft's case, she's probably best known for her classic book, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which is an early feminist classic arguing, as the title suggests, that the rights of woman should be taken very seriously. But less well known is the fact that she was just a scathing critic of inequalities of property. So, for instance, in A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, she takes aim, in this case, at the aristocracy, and she says that from this reverence people pay to private property flows like a poison, as though from a poison chalice, almost all the ills that appear in our society today, particularly the corrosion of our moral virtues. And she points out this is because the rich almost invariably tend to assume that they are somehow responsible for their own riches, even if they just happen to inherit them as if by magic. And aligned with this is this tendency to either ignore the poor or just to instinctively assume that the poor are somehow to blame for their circumstances, even though a moment's reflection would suggest that it's not. Now, I would submit that this is a point that Wollstonecraft took from Adam Smith, who also made this exact same argument in his Theory of Moral Sentiments, where he pointed out how it's the reverence of the rich in our society that is by far the greatest corrupter of our moral sentiments. I can't necessarily establish that because she doesn't directly cite Smith in this passage, but she's well known to have been an avid reader of Smith and had quite a lot of admiration for him. So I'm thinking that's where it comes from. And then later on in her letters, where she's talking about her journey through Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, which were not the Nordic states that they eventually were to become. They were highly aristocratic states in the 19th century. She starts to direct more of her ire towards the emerging capitalist class. So she didn't just have nasty things to say, let's put it about this that way, about the aristocracy. So she actually compares early capitalists in northern Germany, and I quote, to a fungus that spreads everywhere always. And she points out that the kind of nouveau rich that are emerging in big industry very rarely do anything that's particularly valuable, but they very much like to applaud themselves for the very little that they do end up doing. And much worse, she points out, they have display very, very few virtues of character or intellect. They almost always assume, to paraphrase, that the main point in life is to make as much money as possible, that one owes no duties of care to one's fellow human beings because in the pursuit of profit. And they adopt almost a suspicious attitude to anyone that suggests that they should do anything for another person. And she points out that this kind of nullity, this empty void of avarice and greed is what is taken to be an ideal in many of these societies right now. And again, good Smithian that she is, she just thinks that this is beyond contempt and potentially very dangerous in terms of the effect it might have on the broader moral culture of the era. Now, Wollstonecraft was not a socialist. That term wasn't even in the lexicon at that point. But she does argue persuasively that a more moral society will emerge in the event that we ameliorate inequalities of property quite substantially. And she even gives a kind of the only way to describe it is like macho argument for this. Wollstonecraft was quite prone to leaning very heavily on like male forms of argumentation, as some commentators have pointed out, and partly to offset the accusation that she was too effeminate. Maybe we could be critical of that. But she said things like, look, tough-minded, virtuous person doesn't want to live in a highly unequal society, because a tough-minded, virtuous person wants to live in a society where he is treated as an equal and where he treats other people as an equal, because that's the only kind of society where people are going to display the requisite virtues that morality requires to one another. So unfortunately, Wollstonecraft died at age 38 of childbirth before any of these thoughts were systematized in another great work. Who knows where she might have gone had she continued to write. But I point out that in both Paine and Wollstonecraft's case, you start to see the emergence of a kind of liberal socialist outlook, where in both of the authors, they're drawing a tight connection between this need to ameliorate the extraordinarily corrosive effects of inequalities of property in order to more securely put liberal and Republican principles on a firm foundation.
But they weren't liberal socialists yet, or were they?
No, I say that they aren't, right? I mean, let's be clear, right? Socialism as a distinct political and economic ideology only really emerged in the early 19th century with the Saint-Simonians, the Owenites, and others. So they, of course, would not call themselves a liberal socialist because even the term liberal wasn't particularly popular at that point, right? The term liberal really enters the political lexicon around 1812, 1815, 1818 in Spain, when Los Liberales argue for a new constitution because they don't want a restoration of the old kind of aristocratic monarchy. So they're not liberal socialists yet. I argue that you can only really call a major intellectual liberal socialist when we get to John Stuart Mill.
Okay, so tell us then about John Stuart Mill. What makes him or made him, in your understanding, the first liberal socialist?
Yeah, absolutely. So this isn't just a claim that I've made, by the way. I want to pay due diligence and point out that there's been a recent suite of scholarship on Mill, all very good, which has foregrounded the egalitarian dimensions of his economic thought. Probably the best book in this respect is a magnificent tome by my good friend Helen McCabe for Queens McGill University Press. She wrote a book called John Stuart Mill, Socialist. Very readable, very short. Strongly recommend people pick it up. But you can also look at recent books by Elizabeth Anderson, for example, or Edmund Fawcett. Anyone like that is good. So John Stuart Mill is probably best known for his fierce defense of individualism and personal liberty, right? If you're an undergraduate student, certainly in a country like I'm from, Canada, and you're doing an undergraduate degree in any social science, inevitably at some point or another, somebody's going to assign you at least a couple chapters of Mill's classic book on liberty, which includes a strident defense of individualism, free speech, particularly free political speech. Very, very stirring stuff, right? Less appreciated is the fact that Mill overtly identified as a socialist in his autobiography, where he points out how he is deeply wary of certain kinds of authoritarian forms of socialism, but nonetheless, he proudly identifies under the general designation of socialist, as he puts it, and he looks forward to a day where the kind of goods that are produced in a society will be distributed more equally, and particularly where the goods of society will be more likely to fall into the hands of those who actually produce most of the goods of society, namely the workers. So following McCabe, Mill's socialism is pretty idiosyncratic to him. Like any other great thinker, he's not a follower. He's very much an intellectual leader. So he develops his own unique understanding of what this will entail. And I argue in the book that Millsian liberal socialism has two major features. The first, again, is this commitment to the idea that capitalists really don't do all that much if in the economy. Yes, they provide the initial capital, often because they've inherited it. But in terms of work, skill, contribution, Mill points out it's extremely minor when you compare it to the people who, actually build cars, build computers, build microchips, whatever it happens to be. So he says, for the most part, a mature economy would do away with capitalists as kind of a frivolous, even indulgent kind of decadence. And we would just allow the workers to run the firms where they work at. He says that they're more likely to be efficient in doing this because they're the ones who actually build the cars and market the cars and understand how the cars work than the capitalists. And he says, even if we lose something in efficiency because of this, it'll still be beneficial to move towards a cooperative kind of economy because he thinks that workers who are producing for themselves are more likely to distribute the profits from the firm amongst themselves in a relatively even way. And he also thinks it will morally uplift them because he feels that there's something servile, and this is where the liberalism comes up, right? And basically undignified about being someone in a subordinate position in an economic firm. Mill doesn't care for that because he thinks that people should be, individuals and look after themselves. And he just doesn't think that's possible in a firm where your boss basically gets to tell you when to arrive, when you can eat, what you can wear, all those kinds of things. And Mill doesn't have a lot of truck with that. The second component of a Millsian socialist society is, of course, Mill starts to argue for various forms of state redistribution, right? So McCabe points out that this includes things like provisions for public education, public health, certain kinds of protections for the poor. Nothing that is especially generous by, say, 20th century standards, but certainly by 19th century standards, the kind of welfare state or proto-welfare state that Mill argues for was quite expansive. And I agree with Elizabeth Anderson that had he lived into the 20th century and seen the advent of things like Nordic social democracy, for example, and the kinds of social security that are provided there, there's very little evidence to suggest that he would not sign off on it very quickly, given that he was already very much on the bleeding edge of arguing for redistributive policies by the 19th century. So I want to acknowledge Mill's socialism or liberal socialism also has serious limitations. So my book is not a hagiography of these figures. I point out that liberal socialist theory and liberal socialist practice failed for a lot of different reasons. And there's also pretty substantial moral deficiencies, to my mind, at least, in a lot of the figures. So in Mill's case, I'm very critical, for example, of his endorsement of imperialism and frankly, the racist attitudes he took towards people in India and many parts of the globe, where he would insist that one day they might be ready for things like self-governance, but despotism is appropriate for people who are in a kind of childlike situation. We need to kind of assume control over their business until they're mature enough to assume control of it for themselves. I think that that's a pretty awful view to take, and I'm quite critical of Mill for that. I also follow Marx in being critical of Mill's view that, we could kind of just engage in reformist enterprises to move towards a cooperativist economy. I agree with Marx that this is probably almost invariably going to entail more pushback from capital. And so certain forms of struggle are going to be necessary if we're going to change relations of production in such a foundational way. Nonetheless, I think that Mill's liberal socialism is a noble but flawed beginning, I think is the way that I put it in the book, kind of echoing Martha Nussbaum's famous title. Not perfect, but definitely a pretty good and pretty auspicious start.
So you mentioned Karl Marx there. Tell us a little bit more about him. I mean, what would he have to say about liberal socialism, and what do you think from his work would contribute to liberal socialism?
Well, I think that Marx would be very critical of elements of liberal socialism, but in a sophisticated way, right? So okay. I'm drawing very heavily here on works like Igor Shokatbrod's revisiting Karl Marx's critique of liberalism, and also the work of people like, say, G.A. Cohen, for example. So what Shokatbrod points out is that it is very easy to overstate and even treat undialectically Marx's critique of liberalism. You see this online, right, all the time, right, where people say Karl Marx hated liberalism, wanted to destroy liberalism, was anti-liberal, his very bones. And what Shokatbrod reminds us is that is very much an anti-Marxist kind of position to take, almost moralistic in a certain way. So Shokatbrod points out that in his early years, and Rodney Peffer points out the same thing in his book, Marxism, Immorality, and Social Justice. So Marx in his early years was a liberal, a radical liberal. He argued for things like freedom of expression and particularly freedom of the press. It's very understandable when you think that he was running various newspapers, agitating for political reform in autocratic Germany, and they kept shutting down his newspapers and destroying his livelihood. Right? How would he not be committed to those things? And Marx was extremely critical of certain forms of bourgeois reformism. Obviously, he had nothing but contempt for John Stuart Mill most of the time, right? Even though he did think that he was a more impressive figure than the mere vulgar economist. But it's important to note that Mill also argued that the bourgeois was, of course, the most revolutionary class that had ever existed, and had undoubtedly brought about the freest, most equal, most productive society that had ever existed. And I think that this is something that is sometimes missed in vulgar Marxist kind of critiques of liberalism and even capitalism, right? If you look at the Communist Manifesto, right, it's very clear that Marx and Engels both say the bourgeois has brought about wonders that the world has never seen. And they mean that as a positive thing, right? It has swept away all the old venerable prejudices and forced man to confront his real conditions for the first time. So in terms of Marx's mature approach to socialism, I agree with Schuckenbrod and others that he's very insistent that any kind of view of socialism that entails it being a millenarian break from bourgeois society is invariably utopian in the bad sense and doomed to failure. This comes through most clearly in his classic piece, A Critique of the Gotha Program, right, where he points out that there's this kind of socialist idea that holds we can just break from the old society and build an entirely new one as if from some magical blueprint. And Marx says, no, right? The reality is that if we are good historical materialists, we need to recognize that any socialist society to emerge, even after a big revolution, is going to be, to use his term, stamped by many features of the old society. We're not going to transcend what he calls bourgeois right or bourgeois recht in a day or a month or even a couple of years. And we're going to need to maintain a lot of those institutions and those practices in a transitional phase that could last very, very long time on the road to whatever you want to call it, full communism, right? Where we can finally indulge in the moral principle of from each according to his ability, to each according to his means, to his needs, excuse me. So what I point out drawing upon this is it's very clear that Marx would be critical of bourgeois reformism of the sort that Mill endorsed, arguing that it does not take into sufficient account the forms of power that are present in the relations of production and its naivete on these limits, its emancipatory capacity. And I want to point out, as somebody who is enormously influenced and enormously fond of Marx, I think that that's a legitimate criticism of the liberal socialist tradition. Maybe we can get into that later on. But I also think it's important to note that Marx was more sympathetic to many elements of liberalism than some of his most vulgar appropriators appreciate. And again, following Schuckenbrod and my reading of the Critique of the Gotha Program, he was also pretty insistent that liberalism is not just going to go away in a socialist society, even if people wanted it to. And the expectation that it would go away is ahistorical and anti-materialist.
Mhm. So before we move on to other topics, there's one last major figure that I would like to ask you about. It is John Rawls. So
Sure.
which of his ideas can be associated with liberal socialism?
Sure. Well, for those of your listeners who don't know, so John Rawls is probably the most famous American political philosopher, not probably, just is the most famous American political philosopher of the 20th century, author of a really long and tedious but very interesting book called The Theory of Justice. I say it's long and tedious because, it's very, very technical, very academic. Rawls was a professor at Harvard University, and he writes like it. So at the core of his argument is a thought experiment that leads to two principles of justice. So Rawls says, I want us to imagine a group of people who are choosing principles to govern what he calls the basic structure of society. And it's important to note that Rawls is saying these principles are going to apply to the basic structure of society because that is a subtle but very important shift in liberal thinking that Rawls enacts. Earlier liberals would insist that actually the first subject of justice, as Rawls would put it, is the individual and their rights. Rawls says, no, it's actually the basic structure that is the first subject of justice. And then in his lectures of political philosophy, he points out that this is something that he picked up directly from Hegel. And by extension, certain kinds of Marxism, right? Because he recognized upon reading Hegel that, again, human beings are social animals. There's the methodological collectivism for you. And it's only within a just basic structure that individual rights and individual flourishing can be guaranteed. So just wanted to pause right there. So his reasoners have special restrictions imposed upon their political epistemology, where he says, look, these are individuals who are self-interested. They're neither angels or devils. They more or less want to be well taken care of in whatever society they wind up creating. And they have knowledge of basic facts about human psychology, human economics, human history, that kind of thing. But they don't know many of the particulars about who they're going to be as individuals. They don't know their sex. They don't know their class position. They don't know their religious orientation. Many contemporary Rawlsians have also pointed out sexual orientation would probably fall behind what he calls the veil of ignorance, etc. So they exist behind a veil of ignorance, as he puts it, in an original position. And Rawls wanted this idea to capture certain kinds of Kantian ideas about the importance of reasoning about morality and politics from a position of rationality and impartiality, right? Because he argued, I think quite persuasively, that very often when we reason morally about issues, we do so in a very slanted way that's intended to favor our own interests and our own dispositions, right? Catholics will almost invariably sit there and think we'd all be better off if we live in a Catholic society. Rich people always think we'd be better off living in a society where income taxes were lower. You get the idea. So this way, this kind of information is removed from people's reasoning, so they can't reason in that way. They have to think more about what it would be like to enter into society if there was someone who adopted different kinds of viewpoints or was in a different situation than themselves. So to make a very long and very technical story a little shorter, Rawls argues that there are three principles of justice that people would adopt behind this veil of ignorance in what he calls the original position. The first is a principle of justice that is committed to equal liberties for all, at least equal liberties compatible with the same equal liberties for everyone else. There's some complicated questions we can ask about that, but we'll put that aside right now. The more important one is the second principle of justice, really the two other principles of justice. First off, that people need to have fair quality of opportunity to access things like jobs and opportunities and social positions in their society. And secondly, he argues for what's called the difference principle, this idea that social and economic inequalities in a society are justifiable, but only if you can demonstrate that those social and economic inequalities work to the benefit of the least well-off. And I want to point out only the least well-off, right? So it's from the standpoint of the least well-off that you adjudicate how just your society is. So for a long time, Rawls's theory of justice was interpreted to be kind of a left liberal proto-social democratic defense of the mid-century welfare state of the sort that you see emerging in many European countries, or for that matter, to a lesser extent, in, for instance, FDR or Lyndon Johnson's United States. Think about the New Deal or the Great Society programs. But interestingly enough, Rawls actually explicitly rejected that interpretation of his work by the time of Justice is Fairness, a Restatement, which is the last book that he wrote. Kind of a swan song summarizing some responses to criticisms and kind of re-articulating the whole theory. So in this book, Rawls says, look, the problem with welfare states is even though they're clearly superior, and he wants to be very obvious about that, to unbridled capitalism, just better in every way, they still permit too many inequalities that are clearly not to the benefit of the least well-off. And just as importantly, the kind of inequalities that they allow in economic terms align with or generate, probably a better term, political inequalities, because people who are really, really rich, for pretty obvious reasons, tend to like to use that money in order to obtain political power. And this means that the fair quality of basic liberties, or fair value of basic liberties, particularly political liberties, so central to many facets of liberalism, are undermined by economic inequality. So he says, really, the only kind of society that could properly instantiate, or societies that could properly instantiate liberal justice, as Rawls understands it, would either be what he calls a property-owning democracy or a liberal socialist society. And in other works, like his lectures again on political philosophy, he lays out certain kinds of core tenets that he would associate with liberal socialism. You can talk about them if you want. I've already talked for a very long time. But I think that there's a lot going to this Rawlsian vision, and I'm very sympathetic to it in many respects, as I'm sure came through in the book.
Right. So let me ask you now, how does liberal socialism relate to something like social democracy?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I agree with Scott Sahan. Scott Sahan is a logician who wrote a great recent book called Socialism, A Logical Defense. People should read it if they get a chance. But he points out correctly, I think, that it's very easy, again, to think about political and economic systems in these kind of bifurcated terms, right? You're either a socialist society or you're a capitalist society. You're a liberal society or an authoritarian society. And he points out that in the real world, oftentimes what we see instead is a continuum of different practices or a blend of different practices, right? Any country in the world really has a mixed economy, right? Where the state does some things, private actors do some things, and sometimes even international actors will do certain kinds of things. And the argument that Scott Sahan points out is that the line between social democracy and socialism is somewhat blurry, right? There's a continuum. The difference operates on a continuum rather than a strict either or. So the way that I interpret this difference is that social democracy, generally speaking, has been much more oriented around redistributive policies that are intended to ameliorate inequality, and particularly to ameliorate the worst consequences of poverty, rather than changing relations of production, to use the Marxist term, by, for instance, fundamentally challenging the power of capital, or fundamentally challenging the wage-labor relationship. And I argue that in a liberal socialist society, we would definitely want to engage in intensive redistributive schemes. I agree with Mill and Rawls about that. But a good liberal social society would want to be much more militant in trying to challenge the forms of domination that exist at the level of the relations of production by moving towards something like workplace democracy, which again is very much an idea that I draw from John Stuart Mill. Now, how this could be done practically, I actually don't really have very much to say about that, unfortunately, because as somebody who operates in kind of a theoretical vein, praxis isn't always my strong point. So I leave it to others who are far smarter on this point than I am, if they like the idea, to kind of take it forward and roll with it. But I think that would be the kind of core difference between a social democrat and a liberal socialist. Although I want to point out again, this is a difference of degree in many cases, rather than a kind of strict either or.
So earlier we've talked a little bit about Karl Marx. What about communism specifically? I mean, how would social or liberal socialism relate to communism?
So it's a really good question, especially with relation to Marxist understanding of communism. So as everybody knows, at least anybody who's spent any time in left circles anywhere, the unfortunate reality is Marx and Engels wrote very, very, very little about communism, right? If you were to add up everything that they had to say about it over decades, it probably wouldn't amount to much more than 100 pages, right? Which, if you compare it to the thousands of pages that they wrote about capital, or even the hundreds of pages that they would write about idiosyncratic idealist philosophers like Mike Steiner, it's not very much, right? So it's hard to actually say what the Marxist vision of communism looks like, just because they didn't really have very much to say about it, right? In terms of what we can extrapolate, I would say that liberal socialists share with Marx the vision that he laid out quite beautifully, actually, in Capital Volume 3. So I talked earlier about the developmental ethic, right? This idea that it's the development of human capacities or human powers that should be the end of a good society. And in Capital Volume 3, Marx expressly aligns himself with this ethic, if you want to call it that, although he probably wouldn't want to call it an ethic. So Marx says, look, in capitalist society, it is definitely the case that certain kinds of human powers are developed by capital. To go back to the Adam Smith example, if I am the owner of a pin factory and you work in my pin factory, then needless to say, I want to help you develop your power to make pins more effectively, because that'll be beneficial to me for pretty obvious reasons. The problem is that I'm only going to want to develop your powers to make pins, because that's the only thing that is profitable for my firm. And this is one of the problems that Marx stresses again and again and again, how under capitalism, the only kinds of human powers that are developed for many people are those that are necessary for the pursuit of profit and efficiency within firms, which means that the full range of human powers that an individual might possess and might want to develop never are, right? And he says that under a communist society, the development of human powers will no longer be a means the way that it is under capitalism, right? A means to economic efficiency and profit seeking, but it'll be an end in itself for the first time. And I think that all liberal socialists are committed to very much the same vision. Just to give two examples again, we talked about John Stuart Mill, right? Continuously emphasized the importance of individuals becoming full-sided and developing themselves like living trees that kind of extend to their natural parameters, and arguing that socialism was necessary to achieve that. Or John Rawls, right? Talked about him a few seconds ago. John Rawls very much emphasizes what he calls the Aristotelian principle in theory of justice, where he says human beings very much like to exercise their fundamental capacities, and they enjoy developing those capacities and becoming better at higher order activities, whether, again, it's playing the violin or writing a book or being a good father or a good football player, whatever it happens to be. And he points out how a good society would be committed to this Aristotelian principle in a very robust way. So that's where I think you can see a strong ethical symmetry between what's sometimes called Marx's Aristotelian or Hegelian vision of human development and liberal socialism's view of human development. Now, in terms of where there can be some contrasts, in the book, I point out how in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels argue for what's sometimes called the form of democratic centralism that was profoundly influential on people like Lenin, right? This idea that you'd have a vanguard party or a proletarian party that would seize power, instantiate a dictatorship of the proletariat for a brief period of time, corrode private ownership of the means of production, and eventually work one's way to communism. And I point out that any liberal socialist would be very critical of this idea of democratic centralism because they'd be extremely anxious about allowing these enormous powers to concentrate in the hands of a single party, even a proletarian party. And I think that the 20th century has borne out those anxieties very, very, very well, right? Whatever you think about Marxism, Leninism, or Maoism, very few people would characterize the societies that they built as democratic, even if they were highly centralized in certain kinds of ways. Now, I point out in the book that Marx himself seems to have drifted away from this political vision of what communism would look like by the time of pamphlets like The Civil War in France, where he points out instead, actually, what we'd have is a highly democratic, even hyper-democratic National Assembly, where people could elect representatives to operate on their behalf, but then recall them almost at any given moment. And this National Assembly would have certain kinds of powers to govern for the nation, but a lot of powers would be devolved to regional councils and regional assemblies that would be responsible for organizing production and organizing social life in different towns and cities. And if you think about it, that makes an awful lot of sense, right? Marx wanted people to be involved in their own self-governance and be highly involved in the production process. The idea that this would all be oriented by Paris or Berlin or wherever it happens to be would be an anathema to this aspiration. But again, he doesn't really defend this idea at any great length. It's just kind of sketched out, admiringly drawing from the experience of the Paris Commune. I thought it could certainly an improvement on democratic centralism, circa the Communist Manifesto, but it still has certain kind of foundational problems. In particular, the liberal in me is wary of this idea of giving the legislative branch of government just sweeping powers to make changes without any substantial checks imposed upon it by something like, say, a Bill of Rights, for example. So again, I don't want to be too hard on Marx because many vulgarizers and reactionaries have wildly distorted his work in ways that are just unrecognizable and, frankly, I think almost illiterate. And I'm a huge admirer of Marx. I do think that there are problems with this. And if you're going to try to make an argument for communism in the 21st century, it is incumbent upon you to, I think, answer many people's anxieties about why many people who marched under that banner in the past ended up marching people to some very dark places.
So, generally speaking, what would you say are perhaps some of the main shortcomings of liberal socialism?
Yeah, I'm very grateful that you asked that question, actually, because as I point out in the book, and a few people have missed this already, that's just me being cranky, so I apologize. The book is not a defense of liberal socialism, but a retrieval of liberal socialism. So a retrieval is a term, again, coined by C.B. Macpherson, and refers to this historical tendency to go back and to try to retrieve, in a political tradition, egalitarian and liberatory impulses and ideas that have maybe been forgotten or even actively sidelined. And of course, I think that liberal socialism is a liberatory and egalitarian doctrine that is worth retrieving, both for intellectual sake, for intellectual reasons, and also for political reasons. But I point out in the book that it's not a defense of liberal socialism, because the reality is that liberal socialism in practice was never really implemented in a particularly robust way, and where people tried to do so, it largely failed. And so if anyone wants to identify with liberal socialism in the 21st century, then starting at a theoretical level, we need to ask ourselves, well, what are the fundamental problems with this doctrine and how can we fix them? So in the book, I highlight a few problems with historical liberal socialist political theory. I'll just gesture towards two right now. First off, I agree with Sheldon Wolin that thinkers like Rawls and thinkers like Mill have a very deficient understanding of the nature of power, right? If you compare their understanding of power to the theorizations of somebody like Karl Marx or Michel Foucault or Wendy Brown, for that matter, one of Wolin's favorite students, it's just very clear that there's a fundamental lack of sophistication in liberal socialist political theory. There's no really refined understanding of ideology or discourse. There's a very limited understanding of subjectivization, how different kinds of subjectivities are created. The different ways that media can operate to disseminate ideological views. The way that, say Adorno would talk about that very robustly. None of that really comes into play. And I think that a liberal socialism in the 20th century has to be way, way, way more sophisticated on questions of power than it was in the past. And I think that we see some progress towards that now. People like Tommy Shelby or Charles Mills, for example, who are two people I talk about at the end of the book, took pretty foundational steps in that direction, but there's still a long way to go. The second thing that I point out is that liberal socialists historically have had a very deficient understanding of capital as a kind of global system of governance and a political economy. Very often, liberal socialists will focus almost manically on the state as the kind of primary subject of justice. And you see that very clearly, for instance, in somebody like John Rawls, right? John Rawls argues that when we ruminate about justice, it's the basic structure, basically the state, that is the first subject of justice. And in his work on things like international relations or international justice, he just really does not have very much of great interest to say. You can read The Laws of Peoples, and it's not a particularly good book, and it's definitely not a very rich book compared to his other works. And this is not tolerable when we recognize that capitalism, which any liberal socialist has to be very critical of, is very much a global system of political economy. And here again, I think, is where liberal socialists have a great deal to learn from Marxist theorists like Nancy Fraser or Leo Panitch, who was at my alma mater, passed away recently, to try to understand, the way that global finance interacts with American imperialism, interacts with things like Western geopolitics, you name it, all that other stuff. And then I guess I'll cheat and actually add a third point, which is that many liberal socialists historically have not had as much to say as they should about issues of racial inequality in particular. A lot of liberal socialists are actually very good on issues of gender inequality, certainly for the time. Again, think about somebody like Mary Wollstonecraft, right, as a proto-liberal socialist, or John Stuart Mill, right, who wrote a classic book, The Subjection of Women, probably the only feminist classic I could think of that was written by a man. But on issues of racial inequality, many liberal socialists either had nothing of note to say. Sometimes they had peripherally good comments, like Hobhouse's criticisms of imperialism, but nothing really all that deep. Or they even offered racist apologetics for imperialism and for this kind of chauvinistic Western or white supremacist attitude in the case of people like Mill. So we need to be very, very critical of that in the tradition of liberal socialism and much more aware of the different ways that racism precludes the pursuit of economic equality and society is oriented around non-domination.
Yeah. So I need to ask you now, since we now currently live under neoliberal capitalism since the 1980s, and with its rise and its association with things like neoconservative foreign policy and social conservative moralism, how does liberal socialism relate to it?
Well, liberal socialism is extremely critical of neoliberalism, right?
Okay.
I don't know if I would go as far as people like Michael Frieden in arguing that neoliberalism, its self-description notwithstanding, doesn't even count as a species of liberalism, although there are good arguments you can make to that effect, right? But I think that neoliberalism belongs in the liberal family, with the major caveat being that even if neoliberalism belongs in the same liberal family as liberal socialism, anybody who has been in a family will know that there are many family members that you don't like. And very oftentimes you'll have family members like your uncle or your aunt where you'll think, God, how are we even related, right? So I argue that neoliberalism its ideological roots can be traced back to, again, what Macpherson called possessive individualism, right? This idea that the proper way to anthropologically understand individuals is as kind of atomistic units, all competitive, all pursuing their self-interest without regard to one another, and ultimately oriented by this acquisitive ethic, the idea that acquiring more and gratifying more of one's desires is the ultimate end in life. What neoliberalism adds to this, interestingly enough, qua Hayek especially, is that if you are actually if you're going to create a society of people that are committed to this anthropic vision, we're actually going to need the state to play a much more active role in producing the conditions where people will act this way than earlier proponents of laissez-faire would have thought was appropriate. So Hayek, for instance, in numerous works, used to say this idea of laissez-faire is a complete non-starter. No liberal, as he understood them, has ever been committed to laissez-faire. That is an anarchist position. Every liberal understands that the state needs to play a very active role in creating the conditions for what he thought an appropriate market society should look like. And of course, this could take some pretty dark turns. If you think about, for instance, Hayek's support of things like Pinochet's Chile, where he famously would say things like, if the choice is between a democratic socialism, a la Allende, or an authoritarian liberalism, so-called, really neoliberalism, a la Pinochet, then absolutely, I'm in favor of an authoritarian neoliberalism. And liberal socialists would be very critical of that from a theoretical down to a political level, right? Obviously, we have very different understandings of how individuals flourish via this commitment to methodological collectivism and normative individualism. We have very different understandings of the kind of political institutions that would be required to secure people's liberty. And liberal socialists, I would argue, are far more sensitive to how economic forms of domination and subordination are in many ways the most impactful forms of domination that people experience, and that a good liberal society needs to not just protect them against that, but actually needs to empower them to seize control of their economic destiny for themselves, rather than having their economic destiny be basically held by capitalists.
Yeah. So when I asked you about the shortcomings of liberal socialism, one of the topics you mentioned was racism. What is black liberal socialism, and what would you say it adds to the overall picture of liberal socialism?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the chapters in the book that I'm most fond of is a chapter on a man called Charles Mills, who probably is less well known to many people, certainly than Karl Marx and John Rawls, which is a real shame. So Charles Mills started off as a Marxist, later drifted towards becoming what he called a black radical liberal for a variety of different reasons. But probably his most famous book is a book called The Racial Contract, where he pointed out that there's long been these apologias for liberalism that have been put forward, certainly from the 1960s onward, that suggest, look, liberals here and there might have endorsed the odd racist view, might have endorsed the odd bit of imperialism here or there, but for the most part, they were pretty good on issues of race. And even where they weren't, racism is in no way a predominant feature of the liberal tradition, and certainly not a predominant feature of any major liberals' thought. And Mills really challenged this view quite foundationally, where he pointed out that if you read the works of someone like Immanuel Kant, for example, they are saturated with certain kinds of racial presuppositions. Kant even developed an elaborate, I don't say that as a positive, racial typology, ranking different races, and again, implying very heavily that some of them were just in an immature state and almost incapable of self-governance. And he points out that, John Stuart Mill, who, again, I write admiringly about, was a fierce proponent of Euro-imperialism, arguing that this would be to the benefit of many peoples in the world, because they also were not capable of self-governance. And so having the British run their societies for them would help them mature over a sufficiently long period of time. And I think that Charles Mills's analysis of the subject matters is eye-opening, right? In revealing just how much the liberal tradition has to answer for on the front of racial inequality. Now, Mill, identifying as a black radical liberal, is not rejecting the liberal tradition, right? He says, look, the principles that people like John Rawls espoused, Kant espoused, are all sound. But we need to recognize that they never extended them in any meaningful way to racialized groups that they regarded as their inferiors. And very obviously, contemporary liberals need to do that. And if we're going to do that seriously, it's going to entail two different things. First off, it's going to mean acknowledging that many liberals were racist and endorsed racist policies. And we need to be attentive and mindful of that history. And secondly, we need to recognize that liberal societies might need to engage in reparative activities to try to offset the consequences of long histories of racism, whether in the United States or the Caribbean islands, right? Charles Mills was Caribbean, or elsewhere, right? And I think that there's a lot to this. Unfortunately, Charles Mills passed away quite recently, actually, when he was just really starting to develop the program of Black radical liberalism in books like Black Rights, White Wrongs, and his essay on W.E. Du Bois. But in terms of the socialist dimension of this, in his essay on W.E. Du Bois and in some of the writings in the aforementioned book, he says, look, Black radical liberalism will obviously be a species of left liberalism economically. It's incompatible with command economic socialism, but probably not incompatible with market socialism. And he starts to say that's probably what we should do economically. Again, sadly passed away before we started to see more of this, which I'm personally quite sad about because I would have been very interested in it. But he lays out a preliminary schema that I'm hoping that future scholars might pick up if they're interested in developing Black radicalism more fully.
So I have one last question then. How do you look at the future of liberal socialism? Do you have any specific predictions about how it would evolve in the future?
Well, I am optimistic intellectually and pessimistic politically, which truthfully is not a great position to be in. So I'd much rather be optimistic politically and pessimistic intellectually. I'm optimistic intellectually because I think that there's been a real surge of interest in, if not liberal socialism, at least something that looks a lot like it. Just to list off a couple of examples, people like Samuel Moyn and Elizabeth Anderson and Daniel Chandler and Helen McCabe and Igor Shurketbrod, Helena Rosenblatt have all produced very interesting books recently, arguing for revisiting the liberal tradition, recognizing how much of a debt many liberal thinkers owe to socialism, or even arguing overtly for various forms of liberal socialism. If we think about people like Will Edmondson with his recent book, John Stuart Mill, Reticent Socialist for Cambridge University Press. So I think that intellectually, we're in really great shape, right? There's some very exciting work that's being done in economics, political theory, cultural theory, you name it. And I think that if allowed to continue, the future will be bright from an academic, scholarly, and intellectual standpoint. Politically, though, the reality is that it's the far right that is ascendant all around the globe right now. By the time this airs, the U.S. election will be done. It's possible that Donald Trump will be defeated. It's also very possible he might have won. But whatever the case is, the fact that this is such a close election really demonstrates that there's a mass appeal to a lot of far right illiberal ideas. And I guess this is a good place to close because the reality is, I think that if the far right is ascended everywhere, liberals have only themselves to blame for that. And I include myself in this. And that is because for decades now, liberals have been committed to neoliberal policies that were uninspired in theory and proved enormously uninspiring in practice. And if people are rejecting liberalism for being coextensive with neoliberalism, you can't really blame them because liberals did not offer a sense that hope for a better society was genuinely possible. This is a point that Sam Moyn makes beautifully in his book, Liberalism Against Its Health, the way he points out, if liberals are not able to offer people en masse a sense of hope for the future, then we are unlikely to see our creed survive into the 21st century. And the sad reality is that survival is not good enough. We need to not just inspire this feeling that liberalism is the best of very bad alternatives, but something that actually should inspire love and inspire passion. And I think that liberal socialism is a liberalism of hope. It does offer a vision for a better future. All the problems that I pointed out in the tradition notwithstanding, I think it is worth giving a chance to. And I would hope that people would take it seriously as a political doctrine and try to find ways to instantiate it in practice, because I think that something very much like it is needed if we're going to prevent the far right from gaining power everywhere in the 21st century.
Great. So the book is again The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism. I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. McManus, just before we go, apart from the book, where can people find you on the internet?
Sure. If people want, they can email me, mattmcmanus300@gmail.com. I do my best to answer emails. So if I don't respond to you, it might just be that you wound up in spam. So send it again. I'll do my best. Or they can add me on Twitter at MattPaulProf. And again, I try to be pretty responsive to those things. So get in touch with me. Happy to chat if you're interested.
Yeah. So thank you so much for doing this. It's been a very informative conversation. So thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ricardo. It's great talking to you, and hopefully we'll chat again sometime.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sundo, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Zigoren, Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.